10 minutes ago, Judge Bronson mocked her from the bench, calling her a TikTok lawyer. Now, U.S. Marshals were snapping cuffs on his wrists as the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence. No one expected what happened next. But let's start from the beginning. Karoline Leavitt adjusted the collar of her blazer as she stood outside courtroom 3B, her fingers trembling slightly from the early morning chill, or maybe nerves. The courthouse, with its towering gray stone walls and echoing hallways, loomed above her like a cathedral of judgment. She took a deep breath, tightening her grip on the worn leather briefcase that had belonged to her father. The same man who taught her to fight for what was right long before he passed away. Today wasn't just about her brother David. It was about restoring their family name. Inside, the gallery buzzed with idle chatter as lawyers, clerks, and reporters filed into the courtroom. Some of them recognized her. Most didn't. But nearly all had heard the whispers. A young woman with no formal legal degree was trying to represent her brother in a high-profile embezzlement case against a powerful corporate law firm with endless resources and friends in high places. The bailiff gave a curt nod as she entered. "Miss Leavitt," he said under his breath. "Good luck. You'll need it." She nodded politely and stepped toward the defense table. David, her older brother by 5 years, sat there with tired eyes and clenched fists. Weeks in holding had worn him down. He wasn't the same man who used to teach her how to ride a bike or sneak her slices of pizza after curfew. But when he looked up and saw her, something shifted. His shoulders relaxed, even if just for a second. The sound of the door swinging open broke the moment. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hal Bronson," the bailiff called. Judge Bronson entered like a stage actor making his grand entrance. Late 60s, silver hair combed back with precision, black robe flowing behind him like a cape, and that same smug grin he'd worn for decades. His name was synonymous with courtroom drama. Not for fairness, but for spectacle. Lawyers feared his sarcasm more than his rulings. His reputation for theatrics and favoritism was well known, especially when the opposing counsel had deep pockets. He sat with a heavy sigh, flipping open a thick file marked Leavitt v. Craythorne and Glass Industries. "Well, well," Bronson muttered, glancing over the rim of his glasses. "If it isn't the famous Leavitt girl, here to show us how YouTube law school works?" A few scattered chuckles rose from the gallery. Karoline's face flushed, but she didn't flinch. "With the court's permission," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I'll be representing my brother today, pro se." Judge Bronson leaned back in his chair, amused. "Permission granted," he said with exaggerated generosity, waving his hand like a king pardoning a peasant. "Let's see what kind of circus this turns into." Karoline opened her briefcase and laid out her documents in a careful order. She could hear the rustling in the gallery, the subtle scoffs, the whispers. She knew exactly what they were thinking. She's going to get crushed. This is a waste of time. But she didn't come for their approval. She came for the truth. The prosecution began with their opening statements, painting David as a disgruntled employee who manipulated internal systems to siphon over $600,000 into an offshore account. They had audit trails, time logs, and a corporate whistleblower testimony. On paper, it looked damning, but Karoline had spent the last year tearing that paper apart. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward, every eye locked on her. "My brother has been falsely accused," she began, "and the evidence the prosecution has presented is not only incomplete, it's deliberately misleading." Judge Bronson rolled his eyes, already writing something in his notebook. "I will provide a timeline of security access logs, emails that were withheld from discovery, and one critical piece of footage that the prosecution failed to disclose. Or perhaps chose not to." Now the courtroom leaned in. Karoline walked to the court-provided laptop and inserted a flash drive. This footage was part of the company's own internal audit records. It was mislabeled and left in a public access server. I found it last night after cross-referencing terminal logs. The screen lit up. A grainy but clear timestamp showed a man, not David, entering the server room on the night of the alleged theft. The badge swipe ID belonged to Thomas Breyer, senior executive at Craythorne & Glass. A quiet murmur rolled across the gallery. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Even Judge Bronson squinted at the screen, then looked at the file in front of him. "And you expect us to believe this just happened to appear to you in a moment of divine inspiration?" he said with a sneer. Karoline stood firm. "I expect this court to care about the truth, Your Honor." Judge Bronson leaned forward slowly, his tone dropping. "Be careful, Miss Leavitt. This court doesn't tolerate theatrics from amateurs." Karoline returned to her table, heart pounding, but gaze unshaken. Her voice might have trembled earlier, but not anymore. "Neither does justice, Your Honor." The gallery went silent again. Judge Bronson banged his gavel once. "Recess. 15 minutes. He stood abruptly and exited through the side door, his robe fluttering behind him like a shadow. As Karoline sat down next to her brother, he looked at her with something she hadn't seen in a long time: pride. Outside the courtroom, 2 men in plain suits stood by the hallway wall, their expressions unreadable. Their badges? Not courtroom security. And the moment Bronson entered the judge's chambers, one of them followed. What happened next would shatter the courtroom, the courthouse, and the arrogant illusion of untouchable authority. But that's a story for the next chapter. When the court reconvened, the energy in the room had changed. What once was filled with quiet mockery and smug anticipation now held something closer to unease. Karoline could feel it in the way people looked at her. Not with laughter, but curiosity. She had done something unexpected. She had cracked a seam in a case that had looked airtight for months. Judge Bronson entered the room with noticeably less enthusiasm. He moved slower, his eyes darting briefly to the gallery before settling back into their usual glare. Still, the smirk hadn't vanished entirely. It clung to his face, now thinner, as if unsure of itself. "Miss Leavitt," he said, shuffling his notes. "Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that your little discovery is admissible. Kindly proceed and make it quick. We all have better things to do." Karoline stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. I would like to call my first witness." From the hallway entered Clara Jensen, a mid-level systems analyst who had worked for Craythorne & Glass for 8 years. She looked nervous, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. As she raised her hand to swear in, she caught Karoline's eye and gave a subtle nod. Karoline asked her to explain how server access logs were stored and who had administrative override privileges. "Only 4 people have that level of access," Clara said. David Leavitt wasn't one of them, but Thomas Breyer was. A low hum of voices buzzed from the back of the courtroom. The prosecution attempted to object, but Judge Bronson silenced them with a tired wave of his hand. Karoline continued. "And would you say it's possible for someone with override privileges to alter the digital log files?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. It's not common. It's traceable, but only if you know exactly where to look. Most people wouldn't. But I did review the metadata again after speaking with Miss Leavitt." "And what did you find?" Clara opened her folder and pulled out a printed chart. "These timestamps don't align with David's badge access. They were altered. The system was scrubbed and overwritten 22 hours after the alleged incident." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Judge Bronson cleared his throat and looked down at the papers before him, adjusting his glasses like they had betrayed him. "Miss Leavitt, you're skating dangerously close to accusing this court of negligence." Karoline didn't blink. I'm not accusing the court, Your Honor. I'm accusing the prosecution of burying exculpatory evidence. Gasps echoed through the room. The lead prosecutor, Mr. Harlan Graves, stood abruptly. That's a serious accusation from someone who isn't even a lawyer, he snapped. She's right, Clara interrupted, softly but firmly. I submitted these inconsistencies to your office a month ago. They never made it into the record. All eyes turned to Graves, whose face flushed a deep shade of red. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. Judge Bronson leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Miss Leavitt, what exactly are you trying to prove here? Karoline took a breath, stepping forward again, her voice calm and clear. That my brother was set up. That the firm knew who was really behind the theft, and that someone in this courtroom helped bury that truth. Bronson's smirk was now gone completely. He sat in rigid silence, then glanced toward the court clerk with a look Karoline couldn't quite place. Panic, maybe, hidden under the practiced mask of judicial authority. I will take this new information under review, he muttered. We'll resume tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. But Karoline didn't sit back down. There's one more thing, she said. The entire room tensed. She walked over to the court-provided screen again and pulled up another file from the flash drive. This time, not surveillance footage, but internal emails between senior executives and Judge Bronson himself. The subject line, Trial Strategy, Leavitt. She didn't need to read the content aloud. The implication hit the room like a bomb. Judge Bronson's eyes widened. That's privileged communication, he barked. You've violated court protocol. No, Your Honor, Karoline said quietly. This was obtained legally through a subpoena request issued under whistleblower protections. I filed it with the state attorney's office last week. They're reviewing it now. The bailiff stiffened. Bronson looked down at his desk, jaw clenched. A visible tremor ran through his left hand. Court is adjourned, he snapped, slamming the gavel harder than necessary. He stood, trying to exit quickly through the side door, but found two men waiting just outside. Plain suits, no expressions. One showed a badge, U.S. Marshals. Judge Hal Bronson, one of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You're under investigation for obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, and conspiracy to suppress evidence. We need you to come with us. Stunned silence. No one moved. Then Bronson laughed, short, bitter. This is outrageous, he barked. Do you know who I am? The marshal stepped forward. We do. And as they entered the courtroom, the moment stretched. Long enough for everyone to register what was about to happen. Karoline stood frozen at the defense table, her brother now wide-eyed beside her. The gallery buzzed in disbelief. Journalists scrambled to capture every second. Even the opposing counsel looked stunned. The two marshals crossed the room without hesitation. Judge Bronson took a single step backward, his face pale. But there was nowhere left to run. The courtroom had fallen into absolute silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel loud. Karoline didn't move. No one did. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Judge Bronson stood there, his black robe no longer regal but sagging around his shoulders like a costume too heavy for the man inside it. His eyes darted between the two U.S. Marshals now making their way down the aisle. No more smugness, no sarcasm, only disbelief and fear. This is ridiculous, he muttered, stepping back toward his bench. You can't just barge in here like this. I'm a sitting judge. One of the marshals calmly displayed a warrant. You are under federal investigation. We have cause and authorization. You'll have your say in a different courtroom. Bronson's lip curled, but his voice wavered. This is political. It's revenge. That girl, she's orchestrating some circus for attention. He pointed straight at Karoline. For a brief moment, his old arrogance flickered. But Karoline didn't flinch. She stood rooted, watching every second. Not out of satisfaction. Not yet. But because she wanted to remember this moment in detail. She wanted to burn it into her memory. The exact second power shifted. The second no one in the room could deny the truth anymore. "You're making a mistake," Bronson tried again, louder now. "I've been on this bench for 26 years. I know how the system works." "That's the problem," one marshal replied, stepping behind him. "You knew exactly how it works." With a swift, mechanical motion, the marshal pulled Bronson's hands behind his back and clicked the cuffs into place. The echo of steel locking echoed in the high ceilings. A collective gasp broke the stillness. A woman in the gallery dropped her phone. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." And then it happened. The moment no one could have expected. Bronson, the same man who spent years commanding silence with a look, screamed. Not a defiant shout, not a lawyer's protest, a scream, raw, desperate, almost childlike. "No, no, you can't do this! You can't! This is my court!" He thrashed against the marshals, but his age, his weight, the years of authority that once protected him, none of it mattered now. They lifted him with practiced control and guided him down the same aisle that defendants had walked for decades under his judgment. And now it was his turn. Every person in the room stared as he passed. The gallery, the clerk, the opposing counsel. Even Graves, the prosecutor who had once looked invincible, sank in his chair, eyes wide and sweat on his brow. Bronson's shoes scraped against the polished floor as he twisted, trying to look back, maybe for help, maybe to salvage dignity. But there was nothing left. Just silence. Just shame. Just Karoline, watching. A reporter finally snapped out of the shock and raised her phone. "Judge Bronson, can you comment on the charges?" "Comment?" Bronson bellowed. "This is a coup! She's manipulating all of you! She's nothing but a—" The marshals pushed the doors open, and his voice disappeared into the hallway. The doors closed, and just like that, the man who mocked her from the bench was gone. No gavel, no robe, just shackles. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, people began to breathe again. The tension released like a long-held breath. A reporter whispered to another, "Did we just witness a sitting judge get arrested during trial?" Another muttered, "This is going to make national news." Karoline's legs threatened to give out beneath her, not from fear, but from the sudden rush of everything she'd held in. The stress, the fear of failure, the long months of doubt, rejection letters, ignored calls, silence from law firms, mockery from friends. All of it. David placed a hand on her shoulder. His grip was tight, grounding her. "You did it," he said softly. "You actually did it." "No," she replied. "We did." He smiled. But she didn't. Not yet. Because she knew this wasn't over. Judge Bronson was gone, but the case remained. The prosecution, now visibly shaken, asked for a recess. The substitute judge would be arriving within the hour, they said. Karoline agreed. She needed time to breathe, to think. She stepped into the hallway, where the buzz of news crews and courthouse staff was already rising like a wave. Microphones shoved toward her, lights flicked on, names were shouted. But she kept walking, past them all, down a quiet corridor into the bathroom, where she locked the stall and pressed her forehead against the cold door. She didn't cry. She just exhaled. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around a parked black SUV where Bronson was being held. One of the marshals confirmed the charges. obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and potential bribery. The details were still under seal, but the arrest itself was historic. Social media exploded within minutes. Judge Bronson, at courtroom. Corruption, justice for Leavitt. And somewhere in a suburban living room, an elderly woman watched the scene unfold on TV and whispered, "Finally, someone stood up to them." Back inside courtroom 3B, Karoline returned quietly and took her seat beside David. The mood was subdued now. The air was different, not tense, but expectant, respectful. She looked around and realized something she hadn't expected. No one was laughing anymore. And then the clerk approached her. "Miss Leavitt," she said gently, "you're requested in chambers by the presiding judge. They want to speak with you privately." Karoline nodded, but inside, her heart began to race again. What now? She wondered. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far bigger. The chambers were smaller than Karoline expected. No dark wooden panels or grand furniture. Just a modest desk, 2 chairs, and soft afternoon light spilling in through the blinds. The new presiding judge, Margaret Avery, sat across from her, removing a pair of reading glasses with slow, deliberate care. Judge Avery was in her early 60s, with silver streaks in her auburn hair and eyes that held decades of quiet wisdom. She had a reputation for fairness, and for never raising her voice unless absolutely necessary. "I've reviewed the preliminary findings," she began. "What you uncovered, it wasn't just remarkable, Miss Leavitt. It was brave." Karoline sat with her back straight, though her body ached with exhaustion. "Thank you, Your Honor. But it wasn't about being brave. It was about saving my brother." Judge Avery nodded slowly. "And in the process, you exposed something far deeper than one wrongful accusation. You exposed a system that looked the other way, a bench that abused its authority, and a courtroom that had forgotten why it existed in the first place." There was a long silence. Then Avery said softly, "There's going to be an inquiry, possibly several. Judge Bronson will not be returning, and based on what you've presented, the case against your brother will likely be dismissed entirely." Tears stung Karoline's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not here. Not yet. "However," Avery continued, "I'd like to make a recommendation, not as a judge, but as someone who believes in justice." She reached into her drawer and pulled out a crisp white envelope. On the front, the seal of the State Bar Admissions Committee. "You've demonstrated knowledge of the law, courtroom conduct under pressure, and ethical standards that would put some licensed attorneys to shame," she said, sliding the envelope across the table. "This is a special consideration form. If you're willing to pursue law officially, I believe you've more than earned the right to apply." Karoline stared at it. Her fingers hovered over the envelope like it might vanish if she touched it too fast. "Think about it," Avery said. "You belong here, not just today, but for good." Later that afternoon, the courtroom filled again. Not for a trial, but for the formal dismissal of all charges against David Leavitt. The new judge read the motion, acknowledged the evidence, and issued a ruling in clear, firm language. "The court recognizes the wrongful prosecution of Mr. David Leavitt and orders his immediate release. All charges are hereby dropped with prejudice." The gallery erupted in soft applause. David turned to Karoline, tears in his eyes. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. He hugged her tightly. "I thought I was never coming home," he whispered. "You are now," she said, her voice cracking. The moment was surreal. Cameras captured their embrace. Reporters scribbled notes. One journalist called it a modern courtroom miracle. Another labeled Karoline a citizen warrior. But Karoline didn't hear any of it. Not really. In her mind, she was back in her childhood bedroom, studying case law by flashlight. She was at the prison visitation booth, promising David she wouldn't stop until he was free. She was pacing the kitchen floor at 2 a.m., alone, exhausted, but refusing to give up. And now, she had kept her word. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some were reporters, others were strangers who had followed the case online. One woman handed Karoline a single white rose and said, "For giving people like me hope again." She smiled, stunned. Another man added, "My nephew was railroaded too. You made us all feel seen." That night, local and national news ran the story on every major outlet. Rogue judge arrested in courtroom, evidence uncovered by civilian sister of defendant. Karoline Leavitt, the hero we didn't see coming. Justice served by a woman who refused to be silenced. Hashtags began trending. Hashtag justice for David Hampshire, Karoline Leavitt. Truth on trial. But Karoline wasn't reading headlines. She was back home sitting on her front porch with David, watching the sun set behind the hills. The same house that almost went into foreclosure because of legal bills, now filled with light and laughter again. "I don't know what to do now," David admitted, rubbing his hands together. "Start over? Sue the firm? Move away?" "You do whatever you want," Karoline said. "You're free." "And you?" he asked. "What's next?" She smiled and pulled the white envelope from her coat pocket. "I think it's time I became what they already feared I was." 2 months later, courtroom 3B was remodeled. The walls were painted a softer color, the lighting warmer. The bench had been replaced. A new plaque hung near the entrance, engraved with a quote, "Justice is not performance. It is responsibility." It was attributed to KL.